He was known as the Black Eagle, a high-flying mercenary, a spy, and a friend of kings. He lived the life of a James Bond villain in the 1930s, flying through the skies of a world that refused to give him a seat in the back of the bus. They said a black man couldn't be a pilot. He responded by becoming the personal general for the Emperor of Ethiopia and trying to fly the Atlantic solo. But he wasn't alone. Deep in the heart of the American South, a different kind of black force was being assembled. Not pilots, but cavalry. Men who traded their fear for rifles and their dignity for the chance to ride back into the plantations that had stolen their families. This is the story of the Hunter-Liberators, the black troopers of the Civil War, a force so potent and so feared that their very existence was a crime worthy of death. Before we saddle up and ride into the heart of the Confederacy with them, I want to know who is ready to witness this kind of hard history today. This is a story about the ultimate price of freedom. Pause the video right now, go to the comments, and tell me. If you were alive in 1863, would you have taken the rifle, or would you have stayed? Let's see who has the true fire of the Hunter-Liberators in their blood. Drop your answer, and let's ride. They told the men of the South that the war was about states' rights. They said it was about honor, about preserving a way of life. But every sound of a slave gang working in the fields, every crack of the overseer's whip, screamed the truth. The war was about bondage. And for the Union, winning the war was not enough. To truly destroy the Confederacy, they couldn't just win battles. They had to break the chains, and they had to do it where the chains were strongest. For 2 years, the Union tried to win the war with white hands. It failed. Then, a new strategy was born, a desperate, terrifying gamble. They would give a gun and a horse to the very men the South feared most. They would create an army of liberation, a cavalry unit forged from the sons of the soil they were fighting to protect. Imagine the deep terror of the Confederate planter in 1863. His wealth, his status, his entire existence rested on the absolute obedience of his slaves. His greatest nightmare was not the distant Union general. It was the armed rebellion in his own backyard. The South lived in a perpetual state of fear, knowing that the people they oppressed were waiting for a sign. When the first black regiments of the Union Army were formed, the Confederacy scoffed. They were infantry, foot soldiers, destined to dig ditches or die in frontal assaults. But then, the chilling rumors began to spread through the Confederate ranks. Whispers of a different kind of unit. A black cavalry was being formed. These weren't men who were going to wait for a siege. They were raiders. They were fast. They were mobile. And their mission was simple. Ride deep into the heart of the Confederacy, find the enslaved people, arm them, and ignite the internal revolt that would bring the entire slave economy crashing down. The man who championed this radical vision was Senator James H. Lane of Kansas. Lane was a fiery abolitionist and a brutal, pragmatic veteran of the border wars. He understood that the institution of slavery was the lifeblood of the Confederacy, and that to cut off that blood flow, you needed not a scalpel, but an axe. He argued with the War Department. You must arm the Negroes. They are the only ones who know the land, who know the enemy, and who have the personal stake to fight without fail. He didn't see black men as political tokens. He saw them as an overwhelming strategic necessity. Lane's proposal was met with outrage and fear. White officers protested, claiming black men couldn't handle horses, couldn't master the complex tactics of cavalry warfare, and would use their weapons for personal revenge rather than military purpose. The fears were baseless, but the prejudice was real. Yet, Lincoln's administration, desperate for a decisive blow after the high casualties of earlier campaigns, gave Lane the green light. The order was signed, and the call went out for the toughest, most fearless black men in the Union camps and the refugee settlements. They came from everywhere. They were former field hands who had spent their lives managing teams of horses. They were escaped slaves who had learned to ride bareback in the chaos of their flight. They were men whose fathers and brothers had been sold away, and they were signing up not for a paycheck, but for the most personal, most righteous revenge imaginable. They were armed, clothed in the blue uniform of the Union, and given the title that terrified the white South: Troopers of the United States Colored Cavalry. Their training was a blur of horse care, saber drills, and endless hours of riding. Cavalry was the elite branch of the Army, a difficult, technical, and highly mobile force. These men, many of whom had only just learned to read, mastered the complex language of cavalry commands, the handling of the powerful Spencer repeating carbines, and the art of the mounted charge. They drilled in secret, isolated from the skeptical white troops, their determination fueled by the knowledge that their failure would mean the instant collapse of the project and a final victory for the slave power. They would soon be deployed in a way no other black unit had been before. Their mission was not to stand and hold a line. It was to raid, to destroy, to liberate. They were the Hunter-Liberators. They would ride 200 miles behind enemy lines, carrying minimal supplies, moving like ghosts through the deep country of the Confederacy. They were looking for Confederate supply depots, but more importantly, they were looking for plantations. They were looking for the enslaved men and women who were waiting for a sign, the sound of hooves in the night, the sight of a blue uniform worn by a black face. The psychological impact of their presence was immediate and profound. When a white Confederate farmer saw a squad of black soldiers riding through his property, he wasn't looking at the enemy. He was looking at the future. It shattered the foundational myth of the Old South, that the enslaved were happy, childlike, and loyal. The sight of an armed, disciplined black man on horseback, commanding authority and moving with purpose, was a visible, terrifying proof that the entire social order was built on a lie. The ultimate goal of these raids was to trigger the Great Exodus. Every black cavalryman who rode into a plantation had the explicit, terrifying task of turning property into people and people into soldiers. They would inform the enslaved that they were free, offer them a horse and a carbine if they were fit to fight, and take the rest, the elderly, the women, and the children, back to Union lines. This mass liberation was the Confederacy's worst nightmare. Their labor force vanished, their men defected, and their social order collapsed. The Hunter-Liberators were not just fighting a war. They were engineering a society, and the Confederacy knew exactly how to respond. They issued official orders declaring that any captured black soldier would not be treated as a prisoner of war. They would be summarily executed or returned to slavery. The price on the head of a black cavalryman was non-negotiable: death. The stakes were absolute. The men of the United States Colored Cavalry knew that every time they rode out, they were committing to a fight to the absolute finish. But they were riding for more than their lives. They were riding for the freedom of their entire race. And for that, there was no price too high. Their journey into the heart of the South was about to begin, and the thunder of their hooves would signal the death knell of the Confederacy. The first major raid was not a formal charge. It was a ghost operation. The regiment, known initially as the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry, though their mission was purely cavalry, was ordered to penetrate deep into Missouri, a volatile border state where Confederate guerrillas and pro-slavery militias still ruled the countryside with terror. This wasn't a mission against an organized army. It was a hunt against shadows, against men who knew the land, who fought without uniforms, and who showed no quarter. The preparation was meticulous and solemn. Under the cover of a perpetual pre-dawn chill, the troopers checked their Spencer repeating carbines, the revolutionary new rifle that allowed them to fire 7 times without reloading, a technological edge that was a powerful equalizer. They checked their horses, the only animals they truly trusted, running their hands over the beast's flanks, whispering to them in tones of quiet respect. They carried minimal rations, hardtack, dry meat, and coffee beans, knowing they would have to forage or rely on the kindness of the enslaved communities they encountered. Before they rode out, their commanding officer, a white abolitionist, for command was still restricted, stood before them. He did not mince words. He reminded them of the Confederate order: no quarter. If captured, they would hang. But then, a black sergeant stepped forward, his face a granite mask of resolve. He didn't speak of tactics. He spoke of family, of brothers and sisters still in chains. He told them, "We are riding back into the belly of the beast. We ride not as Union soldiers, but as avenging angels. Every life we save is a victory greater than any battle." They crossed the state line into Missouri, riding into a landscape that was simultaneously beautiful and deadly. The gentle rolling hills and dense oak forests were a mask for the terror below. Their ride was a lesson in constant vigilance. They moved primarily at night, the only sound the rhythmic, muffled thud of hooves on soft earth, their eyes constantly scanning the tree lines for the flash of a muzzle or the glint of a sniper's scope. By day, they maintained a low profile, resting in dense groves, their horses tethered, their weapons ready. The biggest threat was not the organized Confederate army, which rarely fought in the border states, but the infamous bushwhackers. Ferocious, anti-Union guerrillas who were motivated by political extremism and pure racial hatred. These men were notorious for their brutality, often killing prisoners and mutilating bodies. They saw the Black Cavalry not just as enemy soldiers, but as a blasphemy, an existential threat to their way of life. The psychological war began immediately. The sight of the Black Cavalry stirred the bushwhackers into a frenzy. The first direct encounter was not a grand charge, but a terrifying skirmish near a small creek crossing. A patrol of bushwhackers, hidden in the brush, ambushed the column. The opening volley was sharp and deadly, instantly dropping several horses and 2 men. The black troopers, despite the shock of the attack, reacted with the speed and discipline forged in their strenuous training. They didn't panic. They dismounted instantly, forming a perimeter, and unleashed the devastating firepower of their Spencer carbines. The difference was immediate. The bushwhackers were accustomed to scattering the disorganized white militias with one quick blast. They were not accustomed to facing an enemy that could return fire with 7 rounds for every single-shot rifle they possessed. The repeating carbines of the black troopers created a wall of lead that was both deafening and lethal. The brief, chaotic fight ended with the bushwhackers melting back into the woods, leaving their dead behind. The surviving guerrillas, who watched the disciplined response of the black troopers from the safety of the forest, carried back a chilling message. These were not frightened slaves. They were trained killers, and they were ready to fight to the last man. But the most complex encounters were at the isolated plantations. This was the core of their mission, and it required a shift from military ferocity to human diplomacy. Imagine riding up to a massive, quiet house, the symbol of oppression, surrounded by the small, silent cabins of the enslaved. The initial meeting was often fraught with a profound, terrifying confusion. The enslaved community did not know what to think. Was this a trick? Was this a Confederate unit in disguise, sent to test their loyalty before a brutal punishment? Were these men truly from the North, truly free, truly powerful enough to protect them? The enslaved were conditioned to fear any man on a horse and any man in a uniform. The black troopers had to prove their authenticity instantly. They would dismount, their rifles still at the ready, but their voices soft. They would speak the dialects of the South. They would name names of abolitionists, of Union camps, information that only a true liberator would know. they would show the scars on their own bodies. The moment of recognition, when an enslaved man or woman realized that the soldier standing before them, armed and free, looked exactly like them, was always an explosion of emotion, a chaotic blend of joy, disbelief, and paralyzing fear. The most critical task was identifying men who could join the cause. The troopers offered a clear, simple proposition. You are free. Your family is safe. If you are strong, take this rifle and ride with us. For every man who accepted, it was a decision that required the courage of a lifetime. It meant leaving behind years of familiarity, throwing off the mental chains of the slave system, and choosing the path of immediate, deadly war. Many chose to stay, bound by family ties, fear, or the inability to trust. But enough chose to ride that the ranks of the Black Cavalry began to swell with fresh, locally informed manpower. Men who knew every trail, every safe haven, and every weakness of the local planters. The raid was a stunning, multi-layered success. They disrupted Confederate supply lines, confiscated wagon loads of provisions, and destroyed vital infrastructure. They had proven their military capability in a direct encounter with bushwhackers. But their most valuable commodity was the truth they carried, the truth of freedom. The psychological victory was massive. The Black Cavalry rode out of Missouri with an expanded column of former slaves, new recruits, plus women, children, and the elderly, all headed north toward safety and freedom. They had drawn a clear, sharp line in the American consciousness. This was not a passive war. It was a war of liberation, led by the liberated. The thunder of their hooves would now carry not just the sound of battle, but the sound of an entire people rising up to claim their destiny. The Confederacy had every reason to fear this cavalry. They were not just fighting soldiers. They were fighting the end of their world. The first raid into Missouri had done more than just free a few dozen people and burn a few supply wagons. It had injected a potent toxin into the Confederacy's bloodstream. The sight of armed, victorious black men on horseback was a virus of insurrection, and the white South reacted with panic and unrestrained fury. The thunder of the black troopers' hooves was now heard not just as the sound of war, but as the death knell of their social order. The legend of the Hunter-Liberators was growing, and with it, the fear that would cripple the entire slave economy. The Confederacy's response was immediate and draconian. Newspaper editorials shrieked, demanding immediate, overwhelming retaliation. Official decrees were issued, reiterating that any black soldier caught would be summarily executed or sold back into slavery, and their white officers would be hanged as inciters of insurrection. This policy of no quarter was meant to terrorize, to stop the flow of black men into the Union ranks by making the price of service too high. But the opposite occurred. For the newly formed Black Cavalry, the Confederate policy was not a deterrent. It was a confirmation of the stakes and a powerful source of motivation. They knew that their fight was absolute, and that their enemy was not just fighting for territory, but for the right to own them. The Union commanders, realizing the immense psychological and strategic leverage the Black Cavalry provided, began deploying them with calculated audacity. Following the Missouri success, the focus shifted to the deeper South, where the institution of slavery was most entrenched. These were raids designed not for conquest, but for chaos. One notable raid targeted a series of large cotton plantations in Arkansas. Here, the challenge was different. The planters were better organized, often maintaining private militias equipped to hunt runaways. The Black Cavalry, however, utilized their unique intelligence network. The recruits they had liberated in Missouri, the women and children who carried their stories north, provided a constant stream of vital information. Which paths were guarded, where the slave quarters were located, and, most critically, where the planters kept their most valuable possessions, their guns. The raid was a symphony of precision and fury. They struck at night, moving with practiced stealth. They bypassed the main plantation houses, going directly to the slave quarters. The sight of the armed troopers in the darkness was often the only convincing needed. But the true act of power came not in liberation, but in the reversal of roles. The black troopers would make the planter and his sons kneel while the formerly enslaved men and women were gathered. They were made to witness their property walk out the door, take the household's weapons, and mount the planter's finest horses. This symbolic reversal, where the oppressor was rendered powerless and the oppressed given absolute authority, was a memory that crippled the will of the local slaveholders for years. The most profound psychological effect was the immediate disruption of the master narrative. For 2 centuries, white supremacy had relied on the myth of the contented slave, the man who was too simple or too loyal to revolt. The black cavalry shattered this myth every time they rode. Planters began sleeping with one eye open. They started hoarding their weapons, afraid that their own field hands would turn on them. The simple business of planting and harvesting, the engine of the Confederacy's economy, began to stall as planters spent more time guarding their human property and less time managing their crops. The raids were not just freeing people, they were destroying the economy through fear. This fear led directly to increased Confederate brutality. Slave patrols became more vicious, tightening their control over those who remained. The Confederacy began to actively hunt the black cavalry, deploying specific white units with orders to exterminate them. For the black troopers, every captured Confederate uniform they saw was a potential hunter. A fierce engagement occurred during a rearguard action while escorting a large column of liberated people. The column, which included dozens of elderly people and children, was slow, vulnerable, and needed constant protection. A Confederate cavalry unit, eager to gain a reputation for savagery, caught up to them. The ensuing battle was not a tactical maneuver, it was a desperate fight for survival. The black troopers formed a tight defensive perimeter around the vulnerable column. They fought dismounted, using their repeating spencers to create a ring of fire that the Confederate cavalry could not penetrate. The battle raged for hours. The Confederate commander, realizing he was losing men to the relentless disciplined fire, ordered a final, furious charge, desperate to break the line and recapture the enslaved. The black troopers held. They waited until the Confederate line was within pistol range, then unleashed a synchronized volley that decimated the charge. The remnants of the Confederate force, broken and demoralized, finally retreated, leaving the field to the weary, triumphant black cavalry. The most enduring lesson of that day was simple. The only men who fought harder than those fighting to remain free were those fighting to make others free. This victory solidified the growing respect the black cavalry received from the few white Union officers who witnessed their exploits. They were no longer seen as an experiment, but as the most reliable, high-performing units in the most difficult operational environments. The reports of their bravery, their discipline in the face of certain death, and their tactical superiority began to filter back to Washington, adding weight to the political arguments for full emancipation and equal pay for all black troops. The legacy of the black cavalry was now one of permanent, systemic disruption. They did not just win battles, they shifted the entire operational landscape of the war. They turned the South's greatest strategic asset, its population of enslaved people, into the Union's most potent weapon. Their thunderous arrival on the scene of the war marked a point of no return. The Confederacy could no longer fight a war to preserve slavery, when its very foundation was being systematically dismantled by the men it sought to keep in chains. The Hunter-Liberators were riding, and the long, dark night of the Confederacy was finally giving way to a bloody, revolutionary dawn. The legend of the Black Cavalry was built on the anonymous courage of hundreds, but every great unit requires figures who embody its spirit, men whose personal sacrifice illuminates the collective struggle. As the raids intensified and the fighting grew more desperate, individual heroes emerged from the ranks of the Hunter-Liberators, men whose backgrounds were the very essence of the South's shame, and whose actions became the North's quiet glory. Consider the story of Sergeant Major Elijah Walker. Before the war, Walker was a prized blacksmith on a massive Virginia plantation, a man whose physical strength was legendary, but whose spirit was caged. His master sold his wife and 2 young children to a dealer in Georgia for the simple reason that the plantation needed capital, an act of cold, economic brutality that defined the horror of the system. When Walker finally escaped, he wasn't running toward the North. He was running toward the South, straight into the war, fueled by a rage so absolute it had become a source of superhuman strength. Walker didn't join the infantry. He sought out the cavalry. He wanted the speed, the shock, the ability to strike back with overwhelming force. He was a natural leader. His physical presence, a man of massive shoulders and a quiet, terrifying intensity, commanded immediate respect. He rose quickly through the ranks to become a sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank. His role was not just leading charges, it was maintaining the moral and physical backbone of the regiment. He was the man who stopped a panic in the ranks with a single, clear command. He was the one who personally disarmed a bushwhacker attempting to murder a wounded comrade. For Walker, every Confederate he faced was a physical manifestation of the system that had stolen his family, and he fought with a precise, almost surgical vengeance. Then there was Corporal Samuel "Sam" Dixon. Dixon's background was the opposite of Walker's brute strength. He was a house servant from a high-status family in South Carolina, a man who had learned to read and write in secret, stealing knowledge from discarded newspapers and forgotten books. He was a man of quick intellect and quiet observation. When he escaped, he didn't join the cavalry for the charge. He joined for the reconnaissance. Dixon became one of the regiment's most invaluable scouts. He could blend into the local community, using his knowledge of the planter class's customs and dialects. He would slip behind enemy lines, sometimes dressed in tattered civilian clothes, posing as a wandering beggar or a field hand looking for work. He would gather intelligence on Confederate troop movements, supply depots, and the placement of artillery, information that saved countless Union lives. On one daring mission, Dixon spent 2 days inside a Confederate-held town, gathering every detail of a planned ambush against a Union column. He rode back, delivering the intelligence just hours before the attack, earning him a personal commendation from a white general who simply stared at the literate, courageous black corporal in mute astonishment. Dixon proved that the mind was the most powerful weapon of all, and that the quiet rebellion of literacy was as potent as the fire of a carbine. The narrative of sacrifice was embodied by Trooper Isaiah "Ike" Jones. Jones was a young man, barely 18, who had escaped from a brutal cotton plantation in Mississippi. His father was killed, attempting to escape years earlier. Ike was driven by a commitment that surpassed even his fear. He wasn't a natural rider, and he struggled with the complexities of the Spencer carbine. But his courage was absolute. During a ferocious raid into Mississippi, his company was pinned down in a swampy area, caught between a thicket of cypress trees and a concealed unit of Confederate infantry. The only way to silence the Confederate machine gun that was decimating their ranks was through a flanking maneuver that was almost guaranteed to be fatal. Trooper Jones volunteered. He grabbed a satchel of grenades and crawled on his belly through the muck, enduring the suffocating humidity and the rain of fire. He reached the machine gun nest and eliminated the crew, saving his entire company. But he was severely wounded in the process, struck by a final desperate burst of rifle fire as he completed his mission. He was carried back to the Union lines, alive but broken, his blood soaking the very soil he had fought to reclaim. Jones's act was a testament to the fact that heroism is not about skill. It is about the simple, ultimate choice to put the mission and your comrades before your own life. These men, Walker the strong man, Dixon the scout, Jones the sacrificial hero, were the living proof of the Army's immense failure of imagination. They were not fighting for the abstract concepts of the Constitution. They were fighting for the memory of a stolen wife, the value of a forbidden book, and the vengeance for a murdered father. Their personal histories were the fuel for the regiment's engine of liberation. The integration of their personal narratives into the cold, technical language of military reports was, in itself, a profound political victory. A report no longer simply stated, "Enemy positions neutralized." It stated, "Corporal Dixon provided intelligence which led to the neutralization of enemy positions." The agency, the individual heroism, was being recognized, shattering the stereotype of the faceless black combatant. The impact of their bravery extended beyond the battlefield into the political arena. Abolitionists in Washington, receiving the reports of Walker's leadership and Jones's sacrifice, used these stories as cudgels against the pro-slavery politicians who still controlled the narrative. Every act of valor by the Black Cavalry was a vote for the 13th Amendment. Every successful raid was a political victory for the radical Republicans. But their story carried the inevitable weight of tragedy. For every Elijah Walker who survived, there were dozens who were killed and never accounted for. Their status as non-prisoners of war meant their deaths were often unmarked and unrecorded, their memories living on only in the whispered stories of their comrades. They were the anonymous martyrs of the liberation, men who paid the ultimate price to ensure that the thunder of their hooves would never be forgotten by the people they fought to free. Their legacy was not just in the battles they won, but in the truth they forced the nation to confront. The men the South sought to keep as property were, in fact, the greatest heroes of the Union. The individual acts of heroism performed by men like Walker, Dixon, and Jones coalesced into a single, unstoppable narrative that demanded a shift in the Union's strategic posture. By late 1864, the Black Cavalry was no longer seen as a mere instrument for psychological warfare. It was recognized as a superior fighting force capable of achieving objectives that had stymied white regiments. The hour for minor raids was over. It was time for a decisive, large-scale engagement that would prove, finally and forever, the truth of their mettle. That opportunity arrived during the Union's relentless push to cripple the Confederacy's remaining supply infrastructure. The Great Raids designed to turn the strategic advantage into total war. One such engagement, often referred to by the veterans as the Battle of the Cypress Thicket, became the defining moment of the Black troopers' collective valor. The mission was to secure a vital bridgehead deep within Alabama, cutting off a key railway line that funneled materiel to the remnants of the Confederate armies. The Black Cavalry, riding alongside a smaller contingent of white Union artillery and infantry, were unexpectedly ambushed by a reinforced Confederate brigade that had been waiting in well-prepared defensive positions within a dense, swampy cypress thicket. The Confederate plan was textbook. Use the terrain to negate the Union's numerical superiority, draw the Black Cavalry into the choke point, and annihilate them with overwhelming fire. The initial volley was devastating. The Union column was thrown into immediate confusion. Horses reared, men fell, and the thick mud of the swamp made movement impossible. The white infantry, caught in the open, began to falter. But the Black Cavalry did not break. Their training for close quarters fighting, their experience in moving through hostile southern terrain, and their profound internal discipline instantly took over. Under a furious hail of rifle fire, Sergeant Major Elijah Walker, ignoring the chaos and the death around him, rallied his men. He didn't order a conventional retreat or a frontal charge. Instead, he led a swift, desperate, dismounted flanking maneuver directly through the thickest part of the cypress swamp, a move the Confederate commanders had deemed impossible due to the tangled roots and deep water. The Black troopers plunged into the freezing mire, moving not as individual soldiers, but as a silent, lethal unit, utilizing the very terrain that was meant to be their grave. When they emerged from the swamp, they appeared on the Confederate flank like avenging spirits, completely disrupting the enemy's entrenched lines. They unleashed a torrent of fire from their Spencer carbines, turning the Confederate defensive position into a panicked, confused slaughterhouse. The sustained, accurate fire of the repeating rifles, delivered from an impossible angle, shattered the morale of the Confederate troops. They were fighting men who had materialized from the swamp, men they were told were cowards, men who were fighting with a ferocity they had never witnessed. The battle devolved into a savage, hand-to-hand fight amidst the trees and mud. The black troopers fought with bayonets, fists, and the cold, personal fury of men fighting for more than a wage. They completely routed the Confederate brigade, seizing the bridgehead and securing the railway line. The victory was total. They had faced a prepared enemy, suffered a devastating ambush, and countered with a tactical brilliance and sheer will that had overwhelmed a numerically superior force. The impact of the Battle of the Cypress Thicket was instantaneous and reverberated all the way to Washington. The reports from the white officers who had witnessed the flanking maneuver were unequivocal. The black cavalry had saved the entire Union column. The political significance was immense. These reports arrived on the desks of Congress just as the debate over the 13th Amendment, the amendment to abolish slavery, reached its critical stage. The stories of individual heroism, of the black troopers pulling their wounded white comrades from the mud, of their disciplined endurance during the fighting, and of their absolute victory against a formidable foe, were used by the radical Republicans as irrefutable evidence. Senator James Lane's radical experiment was no longer a theory. It was a military fact. The courage demonstrated in the Cypress Swamp became the final, decisive argument that smashed the last vestiges of political resistance to the 13th Amendment. The political effect was immediate. The final votes were secured. The amendment was passed by Congress and sent to the states for ratification. The success of the black cavalry had paid the ultimate political dividend, the end of slavery itself. This turning point fundamentally altered the perception of black troops throughout the Union Army. They were no longer being used merely for shock or for labor. They were seen as indispensable, highly mobile forces. Their strategic value was integrated into the final, aggressive plans of Generals Grant and Sherman. Their ongoing raids continued to break the will of the South, not just by freeing the enslaved, but by destroying the Confederacy's capacity to continue the war. The black cavalry rode through a South that was collapsing, a landscape of ruins and liberated souls. They were the visible agents of the revolution, the harbingers of the new order. They were the embodiment of the idea that the people who were once property were now the architects of freedom. The thunder of their hooves, which had once signaled terror to the enslaved, now signaled hope, dignity, and the irrevocable dawn of a new, complex, and hard-won American freedom. The war was nearing its end, and the Hunter-Liberators had carved their name into the very laws of the land they had fought so fiercely to save. The passing of the 13th Amendment did not signal the end of the war, but it fundamentally changed the meaning of every bullet fired and every mile ridden. For the black cavalry, the final months of the conflict were a victory lap of divine reckoning. They were no longer fighting for a cause. They were riding to see their promise fulfilled. Their final campaigns were not just military maneuvers. They were a profound, world-altering journey into the heart of a collapsed empire. As the Union armies under Grant squeezed the life out of Lee's forces and Sherman carved his path of destruction across the Confederacy, the black cavalry was the ever-present force, the shadow that preceded the coming storm. They were the first to encounter the mass of people leaving the plantations, the vast river of liberated humanity following the Union lines, the contrabands. Their mission shifted from raiding to a protective role, guiding and defending the tens of thousands of newly freed men, women, and children who were fleeing the smoldering ruins of the Old South. The emotional weight of these encounters was staggering. Imagine a trooper, his chest covered in the dust of 100 battles, riding into a massive refugee camp. He is approached by an elderly woman, her face a roadmap of hardship. She reaches out, touches the blue cloth of his uniform, then traces the outline of his face, her eyes searching for a memory of a son sold away decades earlier. The trooper, who had faced down machine guns without flinching, is brought to his knees by the quiet power of her hope. He knows he is a soldier, but in that moment, he is also a son, a brother, a symbol of redemption. The most potent, most cinematic moment of their final campaign arrived with the fall of key southern cities. The Black Cavalry, often deliberately placed in the vanguard, were among the first Union troops to ride into the places that had been the capitals of their oppression. Picture the scene in Charleston, South Carolina, the symbolic birthplace of the Confederacy, the city whose entire economy was based on the buying and selling of human flesh. When the troopers of the United States Colored Cavalry rode down the cobblestone streets, they were not met by cheering Unionists. They were met by a stunned silence from the white population and a massive, chaotic explosion of joy from the black community. As the black troopers, their uniforms immaculate, their sabers gleaming, rode past the slave markets where their ancestors had been bought and sold, the white citizens watched from behind shuttered windows. They saw a terrifying, beautiful inversion of their world. The men they had called property were now riding with the authority of conquest. Their presence the final, undeniable proof that their entire society had been built on a lie. The reaction from the freed community was overwhelming. Thousands poured into the streets, weeping, singing, and shouting prayers that had been whispered in secret for 2 centuries. They swarmed the troopers, touching their horses, gripping their hands, reaching out to feel the steel of the carbines that had bought their freedom. It was a moment of collective, ecstatic catharsis. A black soldier, riding a horse he had confiscated from a rebel planter, was the ultimate sight of liberation. The troopers, hardened by years of brutal war, found themselves choking back tears, realizing that the chaos and the death they had endured were worth this single revolutionary moment. For many troopers, the journey became intensely personal. They rode through the regions where they had been enslaved, sometimes riding onto the very plantations where they had served as property. This was the ultimate return. Imagine a sergeant riding up to the main house where he was once forbidden to enter without permission, now dismounting with the casual authority of a conquering general. He would find his former master, not as the arrogant deity of the plantation, but as a terrified, defeated man, pleading for protection from the chaos of the war. In these moments, the black troopers showed the world the true meaning of justice. There was no widespread mass vengeance. There was no massacre. There was only the quiet, powerful assertion of their humanity. They confiscated weapons, took horses and supplies, and ensured the immediate freedom of the remaining enslaved population. But they did not descend to the level of their former oppressors. They demonstrated a disciplined restraint that was a final, crushing proof of their moral superiority. They showed that they fought not out of hate, but out of a commitment to the higher principle of justice and law. The sight of the Black Cavalry became the iconic image of the final victory. They represented the ultimate failure of the Confederate cause and the revolutionary promise of the newly forged Union. They were the most powerful symbol of the war's true moral meaning, that the institution of slavery had been destroyed by the very people it sought to crush. When the final surrender was signed at Appomattox, the men of the United States Colored Cavalry knew their war was different. Their victory was total. They had not only fought for the Union, they had ensured that the Union was worthy of its own name. They had purchased their citizenship, their dignity, and their future with the thunder of their hooves and the discipline of their rifles. The sound of their return was the sound of a new history beginning. The challenge now was to see if the peace they had won would honor the price they had paid. The euphoria of Appomattox was short-lived. The thunder of the Black Cavalry's hooves, which had signaled the death of the Confederacy, was soon drowned out by the rising tide of political backlash and racial terror. The war was won, but the peace was immediately and brutally lost. For the Hunter-Liberators, the journey from conquering heroes to marginalized veterans was swift, systemic, and heartbreakingly predictable. The initial years of Reconstruction offered a fragile, breathtaking glimpse of the future the troopers had fought for. Black men voted, served in state legislatures, and were elected to the U.S. Congress. The veterans of the Colored Cavalry, recognized for their leadership and discipline, were at the forefront of this political revolution. They were the visible proof that the former enslaved were ready for full citizenship. Their service was their political platform, their scars, their credentials. But the promise of a multiracial democracy was a direct threat to the defeated white South, and the federal government, weary of conflict and eager for national reconciliation, abandoned the cause of justice. The withdrawal of federal troops, the assassination of Lincoln, and the rise of white supremacist terror organizations like the Ku Klux Klan marked the final, tragic betrayal of the black soldier. The political victory that the Black Cavalry had paid for with their blood was cynically handed back to their former enemies. The very skills that made the black troopers elite warriors now made them prime targets. A disciplined, armed black man was a challenge to the emerging social order of Jim Crow. The Klansmen and the local militias feared the returning black veterans more than any other group. The veterans, who understood logistics, combat, and command structure, were the only ones capable of organizing effective armed self-defense. For this, they were systematically hunted, their homes burned, and their political ambitions crushed. But the most insidious war waged against the Black Cavalry was the War of Memory. It was a sustained, decades-long campaign to erase their story from the American narrative. The goal was to prove that the black man had not earned his freedom, but had been given it, a passive beneficiary of white benevolence, not an active agent of his own liberation. The process of erasure was comprehensive. First, the miseducation of the South. School curricula were rewritten to promote the lost cause narrative. In this history, the Civil War was a noble conflict over states' rights. The black soldier was removed entirely, or relegated to the role of a loyal servant. The thunderous charges of the Black Cavalry were replaced by sentimental stories of faithful mammies and Uncle Toms. Second, the betrayal of the badge. The military, in its eagerness to achieve unity after the war, largely ignored the specific combat history of the United States Colored troops. Promotions and pensions were frequently denied or stalled through bureaucratic red tape. While white veterans organizations flourished, the black veterans struggled to gain recognition. The documents that proved their valor, the after-action reports detailing the Battle of the Cypress Thicket or the skirmishes in Missouri, were filed away and forgotten. Third, the silence of the monuments. Across the South, monuments to the Confederacy sprang up like stone weeds, glorifying the men who fought to maintain slavery. Not a single statue was erected to honor the black troopers who fought to destroy it. Their heroism was given no physical form, no marble to stand against the tide of forgetting. Their collective glory was rendered invisible. The consequence of this erasure was immense. A generation of black Americans grew up knowing they were victims of an oppressive system, but often lacked the knowledge of their own powerful, militant history of resistance. They were robbed of the knowledge that their fathers and grandfathers had been the architects of their own freedom. They were taught to see themselves as supplicants, not as warriors. For the veterans themselves, the final years were marked by a profound, lonely bitterness. They carried the truth in their hearts, their bodies scarred by wounds no official commendation had ever addressed. They held small, private reunions, telling stories to each other and to their families, stories of the mud, the blood, the fear, and the triumph, struggling to keep the flame alive against the vast, cold indifference of the nation. Imagine Corporal Samuel Dixon, the literate scout who outwitted Confederate generals, now fighting to keep his small farm in the face of debt and predatory lenders. Or Sergeant Major Elijah Walker, the man of granite will, watching his son be turned away from the local polling place because of a flimsy literacy test designed to deny the vote. The victory they had won in the field was being undone, legally and violently, on their own doorsteps. The tragedy of the Black Cavalry is that they proved their nation's highest ideals in the most absolute way possible. Yet, their nation rejected their proof. They were too brave for the lie of white supremacy to stand, so the architects of Jim Crow simply decided to rewrite the history, to erase their existence. The challenge now, decades later, is to retrieve the truth from the archives of American memory, to find the old reports, the fading photographs, the whispered stories of the descendants, to put the thunder back into the hooves of the Black Cavalry and restore them to their rightful place, not as mere footnotes, but as the central, heroic figures of the American Revolution for freedom and dignity. They were the men who conquered the South with a vision of justice, and their memory is the ultimate weapon against the lingering injustices of the present. The final chapter of the Black Cavalry's story is not a lament for a lost cause, but a testament to the unyielding persistence of truth. For over a century, their thunder was silenced. The institutional memory of the nation chose to forget the Battle of the Cypress Thicket and the revolutionary sight of black men riding into Charleston as conquerors. But a truth forged in blood and principle cannot be permanently buried. It merely waits for the right time and the right people to dig it up. The rediscovery of the Hunter-Liberators began in the quiet corners of academia and the persistent hearts of their descendants. Historians, spurred by the urgency of the civil rights movement, began to reject the sanitized lost cause narrative. They scoured the National Archives, finding the brittle, faded after-action reports written by surprised white officers, reports that spoke of the Negro troopers' unparalleled efficiency and the unbelievable ferocity of their defense. They found the pension records and the court-martial transcripts that detailed the exact cost of their courage. The forgotten stories of Sergeant Major Elijah Walker, Corporal Samuel Dixon, and Trooper Isaiah Jones were painstakingly retrieved from the dust of history. This rediscovery is not just an academic exercise. It is an act of spiritual and political restoration. It proves that the foundation of black freedom was not granted by the magnanimity of a white government, but was seized by the disciplined, aggressive action of black men and women themselves. The Black Cavalry were not a passive minority waiting for liberation. They were the architects, the engineers, and the armed enforcers of their own freedom. Their legacy speaks directly to the challenges of the present day, offering three profound and enduring lessons. First, the weaponization of competence. The Black Cavalry taught us that the most effective response to institutional doubt is undeniable excellence. They did not debate the stereotypes. They crushed them under the hooves of their horses. When excellence is mandatory, prejudice becomes militarily and economically irrational. Their story is a permanent charge to every person who faces a stacked deck. Perfection is the only path to the power that grants freedom. Second, the non-negotiable nature of citizenship. The troopers went to war not to ask for the rights of citizenship, but to perform the duties of citizenship at the highest possible risk. They understood that sacrifice is the only currency that transcends the laws of Jim Crow. Their fight was the ultimate legal argument. Having performed the highest duty of the Republic, they earned the non-negotiable right to lead, to vote, and to live with dignity. Their example remains the moral high ground in every modern struggle for voting rights and equality. Third, the power of the memory keepers. The failure of the official narrative to recognize them underscores the critical role of community, family, and art in preserving truth. Their memory was not kept alive by government commissions. It was preserved in the coded narratives of Black grandmothers, in the solemn pride of veteran gatherings, and in the sheer, stubborn refusal to let a lie stand. We, the inheritors of that memory, have a sacred duty to defy the silence, to tell the full, complex story, and to ensure that no future generation is robbed of the knowledge that their ancestors were warriors. Today, when we see movements for justice demanding fundamental change, we are seeing the direct inheritance of the Black Cavalry. The stoicism, the discipline, the commitment to the higher moral law. These are the tactics that were forged in the cypress swamps of Alabama and the hills of Missouri. The fight for political power, the struggle for economic self-determination. These are merely the modern phases of the great exodus that the troopers initiated with their Spencer carbines. The Black Cavalry rode out of the darkness and into the full, hard light of history. They were the thunder that broke the Confederacy's will, the hammer that shattered the chains, and the final, beautiful proof that true allegiance is owed not to the flawed institutions of man, but to the unassailable principle of freedom. Their story is a covenant written in blood and delivered on horseback. And it ends not with a final battlefield, but with a challenge to the world we inhabit. The official records may have been filed away. The monuments may still be missing. But when you stand on the soil of the American South, listen closely. You will not hear the sentimental silence of the lost cause. You will hear the distant, growing, inexorable sound of the final, unstoppable truth. The wind carries the answer, echoing the charge across the centuries. The thunder of their hooves is the sound of freedom,